Then I think we will move to the next speaker, which is Alan Winfield, who just came online and had his microphone also set up. So Alan Winfield, as I said in the beginning of the session, is a professor of electrical engineering, director of the Science Communication Unit at the University of the West of England, and he's also an advocate of robot ethics, and he's also in the Ethics Advisory Board of the Human Brain Project, which is an independent board to the Human Brain Project, and his presentation under the theme of human-robot interaction, psychological and ethical issues. So I'm very curious to hear what he will say. And the commentator on this session is Marc-Oliver Gewaltig, who we've already heard from in this first session. And as I said, he's the leader of the neurorobotics section of the Blue Brain Project and co-director of the neurorobotics sub-project of the Human Brain Project. So I'm very looking much forward to your presentations in this part of our webinar. So if everything works well, and I'm now going to make you presenter to transfer presenter rights to you, and you should be able to speak and share also the view of your desktop if you like. So Alan Winfield, please.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
I hear you perfectly.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed. I see that I'm the only one with video switched on. What is the protocol? Do you prefer video on or off?
Well, I think you're privileged. You can have your video on, but we asked everyone else to have their videos off because it takes quite a lot of bandwidth. So it's up to you actually if you would like to keep the video on or off. But of course, it's nice to see you while you present. So,
okay.
Welcome.
Right. Okay. Well. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. And as you said, I'm going to talk about robot ethics and you know, I'm not a psychologist, but one or two aspects that really concern, if you like, the ethics of human-robot interaction. So let me do the share application thing, which I'll try and remember. Here we go. Share my screen. Okay. And you should now be seeing the presentation. Can you see the presentation okay?
Yes, it's coming up perfectly. Thank you.
Great. Okay. So I'm not going to talk, give you very many slides because I think the question and answer is more important. Well, to give you a little bit of background, around 5 years ago, I was a co-organizer and member of a working group organized in the UK by the two of our research councils, so the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. And we held a workshop over several days, a multidisciplinary workshop, so it was not just engineers, roboticists, it was including social scientists, lawyers, ethicists, a really wide range of people, and we came up with what we refer to as the principles of robotics. And I'd really just like to take you through those principles, but before I get to the principles, just reflect on, if you like, the some ethical problems, if you like, in robotics. Now, this is not a complete set of ethical problems. It's just a very small number that I think are interesting and important at this time, at the present time. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little story because I think you might find this fun. So I think this is 2009. I had a call from the Sunday Times newspaper. It was a Friday afternoon. It was the well-respected science editor of the paper, and he said to me, he said, "Did I know that there is a meeting of the American Association of Artificial Intelligence to discuss robot ethics?" My answer was no, I didn't know that they were meeting. And he then said, "Am I surprised that there is a meeting of the American Association for Artificial Intelligence to discuss robot ethics?" My answer again was no, I'm not surprised. This is a perfectly normal thing for us to talk about in the community. And we then had a conversation and pretty much agreed that there was no story. This was not a story. I mean, really the story would be scientists behaving responsibly. Anyway, I didn't expect anything to appear in the Sunday paper, and of course I was curious. I had a look, and was shocked to see this headline in the article: "Scientists fear a revolt by killer robots." And in fact, if you can just see some of the text, scientists are privately so worried that they held a secret meeting and the conference held behind closed doors. Of course, none of those things are true, but it just really reflects the fact that in robotics and artificial intelligence, we have a real problem with the press and media. It's very difficult, in fact, to actually get the story across when the story is scientists behaving responsibly. Of course, you cannot really have a conversation with the press and media or with anybody very much about robot ethics without reference to Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. I'm sure you're all familiar with those laws of robotics. The one thing I would say is don't dismiss them. I felt that I've known the laws since I was a boy, reading his science fiction, but I've now come to view them as rather more serious than I imagined even 5 years ago. I think actually, well, it turns out several people who knew Asimov tell me that he regarded them really as one of his most important contributions, which is kind of interesting. But I said that I'd talk about some ethical problems with robots, and I think I've got just 3 or 4 here for you. I mean, when I give presentations, public engagement talks or debates on robotics, really the number one concern that ordinary people, members of the public, have is jobs. So it's clear that any discussion about robot ethics should have at the top of its list the societal or ethical problem of robots that displace jobs. I won't rehearse the background to this. I'm sure that you're all very familiar with this very genuine concern. And of course, you'll know that a number of prominent economists are really talking about this really quite seriously. I can recommend the book, The Second Machine Age, for instance, by Brynjolfsson and McAfee, who suggest that there is something really different going on this time. This is not just like previous, if you like, waves of automation. Perhaps we can debate that. My second ethical question, which I'm sure that this has come up already, I suspect Peter will have discussed this, is the societal ethical problem of robots that pull the trigger.
The Army has its own weaponized robot, the Sword's Talon.
And again, I'm sure you're probably familiar with the I'm sure that you're very familiar with the international campaign for robot arms control, which you know, it's very good to see that gaining some traction with discussion, debate in the United Nations. This is again perhaps the second problem that ordinary people raise with me in public engagement events about robotics. The third problem perhaps is touching much more on the psychological questions which you know, you wanted me to talk about. And this is what I call the ethical problem of humanoid robots that appear to be intelligent but are not. So if you can see this little movie, the Actroid robot, this was a robot, a Japanese robot built perhaps 5 or more years ago. And you can see that we're already building robots, android robots, that look remarkably lifelike. You can see also this Geminoid modeled on this chap, Henrik Schäfer. And if you were to see one of these robots across the other side of a crowded room and you glanced at them, you'd probably think it was a person. Of course, if you actually interact with the robot, it will take only a very few minutes for you to realize that it's not a person, it's a robot. In fact, it's a very unintelligent robot. And this raises the problem, the ethical problem, what I call the brain-body mismatch problem. Essentially, the problem that we can already build robots that look remarkably lifelike, but in fact are probably not much smarter than a washing machine. I think that is a serious ethical problem, and my own view is that we should not be building robots at all whose appearance mismatches their level of intelligence, and therefore whose appearance is deceptive. I believe that android robots are a deception. They create an expectation of intelligence, of intelligent behavior that is simply not present. So again, I think that's an interesting, for me, an important ethical problem. My fourth and final ethical problem I just want to share with you is what I call the ethical problem of robots that induce an emotional reaction or dependency. Now, I'm sure you all will agree with me that we humans are kind of compulsive, almost pathological anthropomorphizers. And I think that that makes us vulnerable. And it makes all of us vulnerable, but it especially makes vulnerable people vulnerable to dependencies on robots that induce an emotional reaction. Now, I think this is an extremely interesting ethical question in robotics and artificial intelligence. I think there are very good reasons that we should have therapeutic robot, if you like, surrogate pets, like the one shown here, the Japanese Paro robot. But I do worry about the ethics of the emotional relationship that will inevitably occur between the user of the robot and the robot. You know, given that the robot, of course, cannot have feelings for the human, cannot, you know, love or care for the human. It can only behave in some sense as if it does. And I think this worries me, particularly with vulnerable users, children or you know, elderly people, disabled people with elderly people with dementia, for instance. So I mentioned, excuse me, I said that this is just a selection of 4 ethical problems. It's absolutely not complete. The ethical risks associated with robotics and AI cover an enormous range from personal ethical risks, like, in fact, the exact one that is on this slide, all the way through to societal and economic ethical risks and environmental risks, if you like, planet-wide ethical risks. So, robot ethics cover a very, very wide spectrum of ethical risks. So, as I say, this is just a very small selection to give you a sense of what it is that I worry about and the people that I talk to, the publics that I engage with, worry about. So, with that background, let me, first of all, let me say that, of course, and this is really the question, this is the point I made just now about the very wide spectrum of ethical harms, and you can see that psychological harm is one of those three. And I mentioned that the wider socio-economic harms that might result. And of course, we as responsible scientists, as researchers in robotics and AI, should be concerned about minimizing or mitigating those ethical harms. So now let me introduce you to the 5 principles of robotics that we came up with in our working group in 2010. These are online, so you can look at these, and I'll show you the link at the end. But so we came up with 5 principles, which are the first 3 are almost echoes or mirrors of Asimov's laws of robotics. We thought, well, that's not a bad place to start. So here's the first one. Very simply stated, robots are multi-use tools. Robots should not be designed with the primary sole purpose of killing or harming humans. This really reflects Asimov's first law of robotics. And you'll see, of course, that with the clause, except in the interests of national security, has been added. I have to say I was not happy with that. There were several people on the group who did not want that qualifier to be added. But these things, of course, are a compromise. And it's certainly true that if we did not add that clause, then we would essentially render this principle meaningless or useless to a very large number of roboticists that we would prefer to be included in this, if you like, persuaded by these principles, and those are, of course, people who work in the defense industry. So that's our first ethic principle for roboticists. I should have stressed, of course, these are ethical principles not for robots, but for roboticists, for the designers, users, maintainers, manufacturers, and ultimately, of course, users of robotics. But we're really, of course, trying to mostly protect the users rather than the roboticists themselves. Our second ethic is, again, very simple. It really makes the point, which is often overlooked, that robots cannot be, and in my view should not be, responsible agents. So humans, not robots, are responsible agents. And it's important also to recognize, and again, it's surprising how many people in robotics and AI forget that there is a substantial amount of existing law, fundamental rights, freedoms, including privacy, that must apply to robots. So, the robots, the AI systems that we're building are not outside existing legislation. That's very important for us to remember, I think. So that's our second principle, that humans, not robots, are responsible agents. Our third one, again, it's perfectly obvious, but it's surprising how many people robots are products, and they must be designed using processes that make sure that they are safe and secure. Just like your washing machine, your car, and the airplane that we travel in, robots absolutely must be designed, maintained, and improved, managed, and so on, regulated using very high levels of standards which assure their safety and security. It may seem obvious, but it's surprising to how many people, especially young roboticists, that don't actually understand this point. Our fourth really is a statement of the very ethical problem that I referred to, my fourth ethical problem, well, my third and fourth ethical problems. We wrote that robots are manufactured artifacts. They should not be designed in a deceptive way to exploit vulnerable users. Instead, their machine nature should be transparent. And just to underpin that, there's a picture there from The Wizard of Oz. So, like Toto, we should be able to pull aside the curtain, revealing the machine, as it were, that we're dealing with. So I think this is an important principle, as you might expect, given what I said earlier, that robots should not be designed to deceive, that was or is enshrined in this principle. And finally, the person with the legal responsibility for a robot should be attributed. This again seems quite reasonable, but it's important to be stated in these principles. It's more or less saying that robots should be perhaps licensed, or have, if not a license, have some means of identifying the person with legal responsibility for the robot, perhaps some kind of Q code or license plate on the robot that actually indicates how you can get in touch with that legal person, be it a company or individual person. So that really brings me to the end of these 5 ethics for roboticists. And what I wanted to do now was to point you here to the URL here, which is this is the principles of robotics that you can find on the EPSRC web pages. And I'd really strongly recommend that you look at these, because not only do you have the same 5 principles, but we wrote a commentary, a more detailed commentary against each of those 5 principles. And also, and I wanted to finish by mentioning this, we also drafted 7 high-level messages, in other words, principles that, if you like, sit above these ethics, which really are these represent our statement of responsible robotics research. Responsible robotics research. You can see that what we have here is, firstly, a principle that we believe robots have potential for immense positive impact, and that we want to encourage responsible robot research. And then we talk about, bad practice clearly hurts us all. Addressing obvious public concerns helps us to all make progress. And the questions of transparency, that we need to demonstrate that we as roboticists are committed to the best possible standards of practice. I hope that I'd like to invite you to read those principles and the commentary in more detail if you have time. So at that point, I'm very happy to stop and take questions.
Thank you very much, Ellen, for this very interesting presentation and for presenting these principles and concerns to us. I think before we go to the general questions, we will let Marc-Oliver Gewaltig from the Human Brain Project give his commentary. Okay, Marc-Oliver, please.